Hello everyone, and welcome to my YNR Official 24 channel. Nikki Newman took her seat, hands folded tightly in her lap as if sheer willpower could steady the storm raging inside her. She sensed that this was not going to be another routine legal battle that Victor Newman could bulldoze with money, intimidation, or last-minute maneuvering, and as the judge adjusted his glasses and began to methodically outline the evidence, every breath Nikki took felt heavier than the last. Each inhale scraping against memories of years spent loving, leaving, defending, and surviving Victor Newman, the man who had been the great passion and the great destruction of her life. The courtroom was silent except for the low, deliberate cadence of the judge's voice as he walked through financial records, testimony, and exhibits that had been painstakingly assembled, and with every document referenced, Nikki's heart sank further, because this was not the narrative Victor's lawyers had promised would dominate. This was not the familiar dance where Victor's power cast a long shadow over the law. This was something different, something frighteningly precise, and as the judge detailed hidden accounts, offshore transfers, and the timeline of decisions that had led to the collapse of trust between husband and wife, Nikki felt the eyes of the room burning into her, not with judgment exactly, but with anticipation, because everyone in Genoa City knew that when a Newman marriage went on trial, it was never just about two people, it was about legacy, control, and the fragile illusion of invincibility. Victor sat stone-faced, jaw tight, projecting the confidence of a man who had stared down enemies far more dangerous than a family court judge, but Nikki knew that look well enough to see the cracks beneath it, the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers curled ever so slightly, as if restraining the urge to rise and take command of the room. And for a fleeting moment she wondered if this was how she must look too, composed on the surface, shattered underneath, because as the judge continued, laying out testimony from accountants and former Newman Enterprises insiders, it became painfully clear that the evidence told a story of manipulation and concealment that even Victor could not easily spin, and when the judge referenced Nikki's own testimony, quoting her words back to her with clinical detachment, she felt exposed in a way that no scandal or relapse ever had before, because this was her truth stripped of emotion, reduced to facts and timelines, and yet somehow more devastating for it. Memories flooded her mind in disjointed flashes. Victor promising her she would always be protected. Victor insisting that certain details were better left alone. Victor reassuring her that everything he did was for the family, and now those promises lay dissected on the record, their hollowness illuminated by evidence she herself had never fully seen until it was presented in open court. And as the judge paused to shuffle papers, the silence stretched so thin it felt like it might snap, Nikki's pulse roaring in her ears as she glanced briefly at her children, each of them wearing expressions that mirrored her own internal conflict, torn between loyalty to their father and the dawning realization that their mother had been right to fight, right to demand honesty, even if it meant tearing the family apart. When the judge resumed, his tone shifted almost imperceptibly, signaling that the court was moving from presentation to judgment. And Nikki's breath caught as he summarized the findings, stating plainly that the court had determined Victor's actions constituted a significant breach of marital trust with material consequences, words that sounded dry and legal but landed like blows, because in them Nikki heard validation and loss intertwined, a confirmation that she had not imagined the betrayal, coupled with the irrevocable acknowledgement that the marriage she had fought so hard to preserve was, in the eyes of the law, broken beyond repair. The decision itself unfolded slowly, each sentence adding weight to the last as the judge outlined the division of assets, the conditions attached, and the court's stance on Victor's attempts to obscure financial realities, and with every ruling in Nikki's favor, a strange numbness settled over her, because triumph was not the emotion she had expected. There was no surge of victory, only a hollow ache where love had once lived, and when the judge finally concluded, stating that the court found Nikki's claims credible and ruled accordingly, the room seemed to exhale all at once, murmurs rippling through the gallery while Nikki remained frozen, stunned not just by the outcome but by the finality of it, because this decision was not just ink on paper, it was the end of an era, the formal dissolution of a bond that had defined her adult life. Victor rose slowly, his expression dark and unreadable. And for a brief, electric second their eyes met across the courtroom, years of shared history flashing between them in silence, and Nikki felt a tremor of something dangerously close to grief as she realized that even now, even after everything, part of her still searched his face for remorse, for regret, for some sign that the man she had loved was still there. But if Victor felt anything, he did not show it, turning away instead to confer with his attorneys, already calculating his next move. And that realization cut deeper than any legal defeat ever could, because it confirmed what Nikki had feared all along, that no ruling, no evidence, no judgment could force Victor Newman to change. As the court adjourned and people began to file out, Nikki finally allowed herself to breathe, the tension draining from her body in a wave that left her dizzy. And as she stood, supported by the quiet presence of those who loved her, she understood that being stunned did not mean being broken, that shock could coexist with strength, and that while this decision marked the end of one chapter, it also marked the beginning of something terrifying and liberating all at once, because for the first time in decades, Nikki Newman was no longer defined by Victor's shadow, and as she stepped out of the courthouse into the glare of cameras and the uncertain promise of a future she would now have to shape on her own, one truth rang louder than the judge's gavel ever had. Nothing in Genoa City would ever be the same again. The shock did not fade when Nikki crossed the courthouse threshold. Instead, it followed her like a second skin, clinging to her as flashes popped and reporters shouted questions she barely heard, her mind still replaying the judge's words in relentless loops, because no matter how many times she told herself she had prepared for this, that she had braced for every possible outcome, nothing could truly soften the moment when the law stripped her marriage down to facts and ruled on it with cold authority. And as she was guided toward the waiting car, Nikki felt as if she were watching herself from a distance, a woman moving through the motions while her heart lagged behind, still seated in that courtroom where years of devotion had been weighed and measured and ultimately deemed insufficient to withstand deception. Inside the car, the door closed with a dull thud that sounded final in a way that made her flinch. And when silence settled around her, broken only by the faint hum of traffic, it was there that the tears finally came, not in dramatic sobs but in a quiet, steady stream that surprised her with its persistence, because she had cried for Victor before, cried over him, cried because of him, yet this felt different, less like mourning a loss and more like releasing something she had carried for far too long. And as the city blurred past the window, Nikki allowed herself to acknowledge the truth she had avoided for years, that loving Victor Newman had required a kind of endurance that often came at the cost of her own peace. And while she had always believed that love meant standing by someone no matter what, the judge's decision forced her to confront the reality that loyalty without honesty was not love at all, but a slow erosion of self. Back at the Newman ranch, the familiar grandeur felt strangely hollow, the rooms echoing with memories that now seemed to belong to another lifetime. And as Nikki walked through the living room, her fingers brushed against polished surfaces she had once admired as symbols of stability and success, now transformed into reminders of how easily power could mask rot beneath, and she wondered how many times she had convinced herself that discomfort was temporary, that Victor's secrets were justified by some greater good, that tomorrow he would finally choose transparency over control, a tomorrow that never quite arrived. Upstairs, in the bedroom that had been both sanctuary and battleground, Nikki sank onto the edge of the bed and stared at the space where Victor's presence lingered like a ghost, recalling nights filled with whispered promises and heated arguments alike, moments of tenderness followed by betrayals that chipped away at trust until she found herself questioning not just him, but her own instincts. And as she sat there now, the weight of the judge's ruling pressed down on her, forcing her to see those years not as failures, but as lessons painfully earned, lessons about boundaries, self-worth, and the danger of confusing intensity with intimacy. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Genoa City, Victor Newman absorbed the decision in his own way, outwardly composed but inwardly seething, his mind already dissecting the ruling, identifying perceived injustices, loopholes, and opportunities for retaliation. Because for Victor, Losing was never just about defeat, it was about insult. And the idea that a judge had dared to rule against him, to publicly validate Nikki's claims, struck at the core of his identity, stirring a rage he cloaked beneath icy resolve. And as he sat in his office, staring out at the city he believed he had built, Victor felt something dangerously close to fear, not because of what he had lost materially, but because the decision threatened the narrative he had carefully constructed for himself, that he was always right, always justified, always in control. Nikki's children, too, grappled with the aftermath in their own fractured ways, each of them processing the ruling through the lens of their complicated relationships with their parents, because while they loved their father, the evidence laid bare in court had forced them to confront truths they could no longer ignore, and as family conversations unfolded behind closed doors, loyalties were tested, old wounds reopened, and alliances subtly shifted, not out of malice but out of a collective reckoning with the cost of silence. And Nikki, listening to their voices, felt both gratitude and guilt, grateful that they stood by her, guilty that her fight for honesty had pulled them into yet another Newman war. The days that followed were a blur of legal follow-ups, media speculation, and private moments of reflection, and each morning Nikki woke with the same jolt of disbelief, half expecting to hear Victor's voice beside her, only to remember that the chapter they had shared was officially, irrevocably closed, and though the loneliness was sharp, it was accompanied by an unfamiliar sense of calm, as if the constant vigilance she had maintained for years, watching for the next secret, the next crisis, had finally eased, allowing her to breathe without bracing for impact. In quiet moments, Nikki found herself revisiting the judge's words, particularly the affirmation of her credibility, because being believed carried a power she had underestimated, validating not just her claims but her intuition, her right to question, to demand more. And as that realization took root, it began to reshape how she saw herself, not as a woman who had failed to save her marriage, but as one who had chosen herself when the cost of staying became too high. Genoa City, ever hungry for drama, buzzed with speculation about what Nikki's newfound independence would mean. And as whispers circulated about Victor's next move and Nikki's future, she remained largely silent, choosing reflection over reaction, because for the first time in a long while, she was not compelled to defend or explain herself, and that freedom felt both exhilarating and terrifying, a wide-open space where anything was possible and nothing was guaranteed. One evening, standing on the ranch terrace as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Nikki felt a sense of closure settle over her, not because all wounds had healed, but because she finally accepted that some stories do not end with reconciliation, they end with clarity, and as she watched the light fade, she whispered a quiet goodbye, not just to Victor, but to the version of herself who had believed that enduring pain was the price of love. Yet even as Nikki embraced this new beginning, she knew that Victor Newman would not disappear quietly, that his pride would demand reassertion, his ego a reckoning, and the judge's ruling, rather than ending their entanglement, might simply transform it, shifting the battlefield from marriage to legacy, from private betrayal to public consequence. And as Nikki steeled herself for whatever came next, she drew strength from the knowledge that she had already survived the worst part, the moment when the truth was spoken aloud and affirmed, and no matter how Victor chose to respond, that truth could not be taken from her. In the end, what left Nikki stunned was not merely the judge's final decision, but the revelation that life beyond Victor Newman was not an abyss but a horizon, vast and uncertain, yes, but also filled with the promise of self-discovery. And as she stepped forward into that future, carrying both scars and wisdom, Nikki understood that this chapter of her life, born of heartbreak and courage, would redefine not only her story, but the very fabric of Genoa City. Because when a woman like Nikki Newman stops accepting half-truths and starts claiming her voice, the ripple effects are impossible to contain, and somewhere deep within, beneath the lingering ache and the hard-won resolve, a quiet, resilient hope began to rise, signaling that while the judge's gavel had ended one era, it had also, unmistakably, ushered in another. In the weeks that followed, The full impact of the judge's ruling continued to unfold in ways Nikki could never have anticipated, because while the courtroom decision had drawn a definitive legal line between her and Victor, emotionally the separation rippled outward, touching every corner of her life, forcing her to confront not only what she had lost, but who she was becoming in the absence of a man whose gravity had shaped her world for decades. Each morning brought a new headline, a new speculative angle from pundits eager to frame the ruling as either Nikki's ultimate triumph or Victor's most humiliating defeat, and yet none of them captured the truth that settled quietly in Nikki's chest, that this was neither victory nor vengeance, but an awakening born from exhaustion. Clarity forged through years of compromise finally brought into the light. Friends and allies visited, offering support, admiration, and sometimes thinly veiled relief that she had at last broken free. And though Nikki appreciated their words, she found herself increasingly selective about company, craving solitude not as escape, but as space to hear her own thoughts without the constant echo of Victor's influence. And in those quiet hours, she began to rediscover simple pleasures that had once grounded her. Long walks through the gardens, music playing softly in the background, moments of reflection that did not revolve around crisis management or damage control. Yet even as Nikki rebuilt her sense of self piece by piece, Victor remained an unavoidable presence in Genoa City, his shadow stretching long and dark as he maneuvered behind the scenes, leveraging connections, applying pressure where he could, determined to remind everyone that a single ruling would not dismantle the empire he had spent his life constructing. And when word reached Nikki of his efforts to reassert dominance, a familiar knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach, quickly followed by a surprising steadiness. Because for the first time, Victor's machinations no longer dictated her reactions, no longer sent her scrambling to anticipate or appease, and that shift, subtle yet profound, marked the true transformation sparked by the judge's decision. Conversations with her children deepened, evolving from cautious reassurance into honest dialogue about the past, about the moments they had sensed something was wrong but lacked the language or permission to name it. And as Nikki listened, absorbing their perspectives with humility and regret, she realized that the ruling had opened a door not just for her healing, but for theirs, creating an opportunity to redefine their family dynamics on terms rooted in truth rather than denial. At night, sleep came fitfully, dreams haunted by echoes of the courtroom and memories of love that refused to fade quietly. But even in those restless hours, Nikki felt a growing resilience, a recognition that pain did not negate progress, that healing was not linear, but cumulative, built through small acts of courage repeated daily. Genoa City watched closely as Nikki stepped into public life again, attending events with a composed grace that belied the turmoil she had endured, her presence radiating a strength that sparked both admiration and unease. Because when a woman long defined by her relationship to a powerful man emerges with her identity intact and her voice amplified, it disrupts entrenched expectations, and whispers circulated about what Nikki might do next, whether she would retreat into privacy or channel her experience into influence. Speculation she neither confirmed nor denied, content to let uncertainty work in her favor. One afternoon, revisiting the courthouse steps alone, Nikki paused where cameras had once crowded, replaying the moment the judge's gavel had struck, and instead of flinching, she felt gratitude, because that sound had marked the end of self-doubt, the beginning of a life shaped not by fear of loss but by respect for truth. And as she turned away, she understood that while Victor Newman would always be part of her story, he no longer authored it, and that realization, more than any ruling or asset division, was the true verdict that left Nikki stunned and ultimately free.